Hi everyone! In this chapter, we will continue our unit on animal organ system. This time, we'll be going over two organ systems, the circulatory, or what we commonly known as cardiovascular system as well, and the respiratory system. So be expected that this lecture will be a little longer, just like the digestive system. In A&P, these two systems are actually two of the hardest systems we talk about in that class. Just cardiovascular system alone is split into three chapters there. So know that we are really just going over the very basics of these two systems. In addition, I did skip over a few sections of the chapter when I think, some of the concepts are maybe too technical for this class and we don't need to get into that deep of it. Hence, I try to make it as simple as I can and also surveying all the circulatory and respiratory system of different animal species that we've talked about in previous chapters. So don't worry, you will see the amazing way we get our oxygen from the air and how animals expel carbon dioxide into the air for this chapter. So let's get started. All right, so the circulatory and respiratory system are highly related to and dependent on each other for gas exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. You take in oxygen, you breathe out carbon dioxide. And there are some basic structures that allows for this very efficient function. And for this particular creature, they're just drawing a simple, animal of some sort that has a cardiovascular system and a respiratory system of some sort, just to show you some of the basic structure that all respiratory system and cardiovascular system needs. First of all, you will need lungs, or for aquatic animals, you will need gills. Um, both of these should specialize with a large surface area. Very important to have a very large surface area because we have to maximize the amount of gas exchange we do with the environment. And why that's the case is because every second, every single one of those cells in the entire body needs oxygen in order to survive. You can't live without oxygen. As we'll talk about later on in the chapter, the moment you cut a cell off of oxygen, they will start dying. And one cell die after another. Before you know it, the whole tissue or the whole organ can be dead and you will be dead. So this is why lungs with a large surface area, or gills in that matter for aquatic animals, is very, very critical. Second, you have to have some sort of a fluid medium, which because things, yes, there is some air space between the lungs and the blood, but you gotta have some sort of fluid medium that distributes everything throughout the body because we're not a body of air, we're a body of fluid. So, in order for us to distribute and make sure every single one of our cell has oxygen and be able to expel carbon dioxide, we have to have some sort of liquid to help us transport all those gases throughout the body. Third, if we're putting some fluid throughout our body, fluid is not just going to move on its own. And plus, on top of that, we have gravity and we go in different positions all the time. We move, we lay down, we sit down, we stand up, etc. So there's got to be a pump that gets all these fluid going. It's just kind of like, having a pump in a jacuzzi, for example. You have to, if it's just, stagnant water in the pool, nothing is gonna, no, there's no massaging, there's no jacuzzi splash in the pool. But you need a pump in there that pumps and draws fluid into itself and then spit out the fluid on the other side. In this case, similar, analogy for the pump inside our cardiovascular system. Um, Sometimes I use circulatory system and cardiovascular system interchangeably. I'm used to saying cardiovascular because we call it that in A&P. So know that, I may use those two things interchangeably, those two words. All right, and last thing, if you have fluid, you gotta also have the tubes because you can't just have fluid everywhere. For some animals, they do have fluid everywhere. But they're usually tiny, small, and they don't need a lot of energy. For us humans or more complex animals, we need a lot of tubes because we can't just have fluid everywhere in the body. And we need very efficient transports and we need a lot of energy, which means we need a lot of oxygen for every one of our cells. And yet we are a very complex system with a lot of cells, lots and lots of cells. So this is why we need blood vessels to make sure we can circulate that fluid and distribute the gases across a large surface area without having to give up the fact that we need to get this oxygen to every single one of our cells and on the fact that we need a lot of energy. All right, so make sure, oh, before we get to that, circulatory system, remember, is also a system for distribution of nutrients and immune cells. So I won't talk too much about those because we are on the circulatory system and respiratory system. The whole point of this chapter, main point of this chapter is talking about gas exchange. So we'll just focus on the transport of gases in this chapter. But know that your circulatory system is not only for distribution of gases. It is also for a lot of other things. We'll kind of gloss over that when we get to the blood components. All right, so small molecules such as oxygen and carbon dioxide, which is our main key characters or players in this chapter, they can travel in and around cells via diffusion very easily because they're very small chemical molecules. They don't need specific channels for them to cross. Like, when we talk about glucose or amino acids, then you need specific channels because they're bulkier. But for these two, very critical gases that we're relying on to stay alive, they can just diffuse. And remember the rule of diffusion from, you've learned this from Bio 1406, is that things always travels from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. So for unicellular organisms, the exchange of these gases goes directly with the external environment, where they just diffuse across the plasma membrane and voila, they're inside the cells. Because they're pretty, usually for unicellular organisms, they're just a plasma membrane with the cytoplasm in it and no other cells. So that's very easy for those species. And for multicellular organisms, two challenges will arise though. Diffusion, first of all, is only efficient across very short distances. Like what we're seeing in this picture here, just a simple picture on how diffusion works across the plasma membrane. We're just talking about how the thickness of the plasma membrane, which is just made of a lipid bilayer full of phospholipids. And they will still take some time for an area of higher concentration to go to an area of lower concentration, eventually equalizing the amount of concentration of the solutes on either side of the membrane. Now, but this is a very short distance we're talking about here, just the plasma membrane, like in the case of unicellular organisms. But when we're multicellular organisms, that's a big difference because the time for a substance to diffuse from one place to another is actually proportional to the distance squared. Okay, so square meaning like 10, and then you square it, right? Just in case, just basic math. 10 times 10, then you get 100. That's what we mean by square. So let's say if one glucose molecule, takes 1 second to diffuse across, let's say 100 micrometer, that's the distance. It takes 1 second for it to go through that, then it actually will take 100 seconds for that one glucose molecule to diffuse through 1 millimeter, which is still very tiny, but probably the micro scale, this is huge. And then if we're talking about diffusing through 1 centimeters, for us humans, that's still tiny in the macro scale form. But for that little molecule of glucose, that is humongous. It will take that one glucose molecule 3 hours to diffuse through just 1 centimeters. So this is what we mean by the fact that the time for a substance or solute to diffuse from one place to another is proportional to the distance squared, not just double, but squared. And that's why it kind of exponentially gets longer and longer as we increase the distance for that solute needing to be traveling through. So that's one problem. that multicellular organisms would face, because usually multicellular organisms have many, many layers, as you can imagine in humans. We have the skin layer, we have then the connective tissue layer, and then we have muscular layer, bone layer, just a lot of things, but yet we have cells, trillion of cells in all those layers. How are we going to distribute everything? Second, I already said there are many cells in the body. How can we ensure every single one of those cells get what they need? Remember, every one of those trillions of cells in your body needs to get oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. The moment they're cut off from this gas exchange, they will die. While there are cases where some, cells in your skin, for example, are dead cells, but with the exception of those, you still have trillions of cells inside your body. So, one adaptation that we have for simple body plan, what they call it, one evolutionary adaptation for simple body plan multicellular organism. For example, your cnidarians that we talked about and flatworms. That's what they have is they actually are their body plan place many cells as possible in direct contact with the environment for gas exchange. If you think back how cnidarians look like, such as Hydra, for example, they are very simple microscopic creatures. So it's pretty much just one layer of cells, maybe two layers of cells, excuse me, and then between the outside, the epidermis, and then the endoderm, which is the inside layer, the gastrodermis in the case of Hydra. That's just two layers of cell, which is still pretty small. So they just try to, shape themselves such that they can make sure every part of their body is exposed to the living environment around them. Flatworms, same thing. We talked about those planarians. So planarians are very flat. So because of their flat bodies, that's why things can diffuse faster, just straight through their body cells as well. Now, another adaptation then for complex body plan multicellular organisms, such as mammals or humans for that matter, a circulatory system is needed to move fluid between the cell's immediate surroundings and the body tissues, because there's just too many cells to deal with and too many layers to deal with. There's no way we can just go stand out in the air and go let the air come inside me. I'm not gonna breathe. I'm gonna cut off my my breathing reflex and just expect oxygen to diffuse into my skin by waving my hand around. That's not gonna work, because of the fact that there are many barriers that oxygen will have to cross over, and we will likely die before we get any oxygen in. So this is why we need a circulatory system for complex body plans organism. All right, so let's talk about the simple body plan organisms first. Um, for these animals, they have the gastrovascular cavity. We kind of talked about that in the previous chapter when we were going over the cnidarians in the invertebrates. So, like I said, animals with simple body plans, such as hydras, jellyfishes, cnidarians, usually utilize some sort of central hollow space that we call the gastrovascular cavity, and they will distribute the substances, chemical, nutrients they need, gases they need, and also digestion of their food within that cavity space. So we've talked about this as well. Usually there's one opening that connects the cavity to the surrounding water, and then it is the fluid that will then bathe both inner and outer tissue layers for gas exchange. We talked about how they have, the mouth and the anus is that one same opening. But we didn't really talk about the gas exchange part of it, which is just relying on fluid moving in and out of that opening. So for the hydra, there's thin branches of gastrovascular cavity right here as well, because we kind of the picture we saw earlier with the hydra, we kind of only see the gastrovascular cavity as only here. But technically, even the tentacles coming out of their body have that thin branch of gastrovascular cavity where it just circulates. Because if it doesn't circulate, then the tentacles cells will start to not be very happy and die off, because of the fact that they can't get that distribution of nutrients and gases. So this is why they have those thin gastrovascular cavity even within the tentacles. That way, every single one of their cells gets the nutrients they need. And this is just a quick picture of a hydra with actually a daphnia inside of it, because that's after it has ingested its prey. And you can actually see through them because hydra are such simple creatures. They're microscopic and see through that you can see what's happening inside. And then for jellies or other cnidarians, the gastrovascular cavity has a more elaborate branching pattern compared to hydra, so a little more bit more complex. Jellies have what's called the radial canals, and then they would lead into a circular canal that's kind of in the middle. So all of these are radial canals, and then they will go into a circular canal that goes around the whole thing, which here they call it a ring canal. Different. You will see very soon that in anatomy, a lot of times they call different things in different pictures, and depending which book or what country it is from, they can call it different things. So again. Ring canal, circular canal, same thing, but they utilizes those canals for distributing your gases and nutrients. And in the jelly and jellyfish case, all of these cells that line these canals are actually lined with cilia. So cilia is for movement of fluid over the surface of the cells. That's for getting the water moving because they don't have a pump. Okay, they don't have a heart like other complex organisms do. So what allows for distribution of the fluid is then those little tiny cilia. They're just, waving their way inside these liquid and producing some kind of current with their little cilia, just like how sponges have the flagella or flagellated choanocytes for them to do, allowing producing that water current. All right, and then for flatworms, which an example we had earlier are cnidarians. They're so cute with their little googly eyes. I'm sorry, I'm just gonna have to draw that. So the planarians, they have a little mouth and a pharynx that's on the ventral side. So this is like the bottom side of the planarian. You can see that there's a little tube coming out of this tummy. So it leads to, so from the outside, through that pharynx or mouth, they go into a branch gastrovascular cavity. So it's branch compared to the thin ones in the hydra or the canals in the jellies. Now all of these dark orange you're seeing are then the branch gastrovascular cavity. That's big. It takes up almost pretty much the entire body of the planarian. So their flat body being, large and thin, serve as a very good surface area for diffusion with the environment. So their cells just exchange these gases directly with the environment around them. Okay. All right, so even though these are just, these we're talking about simple creatures, but they still have, excuse me, maybe 2 layers of cells thick, but that's just still just 2 layers cells thick for these animals, and diffusion can happen, direct diffusion can happen across just 2 cell layers. Might be a little slower compared to just 1 cell layer, but it's possible, and it can keep the animal alive. All right, so a circulatory system, which is then for multicellular organism, is then a lot more complex. So it does have, though, 3 basic structures or components. We've already talked about that. You got to have some sort of fluid that circulates around the body. You have to have some interconnecting vessels that house these fluid and get these fluids going. And then you have to have a muscular pump, which is the heart for getting those fluids somewhere. Without the pump, all the water or fluid will just be stagnant and nothing can go anywhere. And things will be pulled down just by gravity. All right, so the heart powers circulation by using energy, a lot of energy. This is why heart cells can never be deprived of energy in that sense. Oxygen. You cannot deprive the hearts of oxygen. We'll get to this in the mammalian and animals, human case. As soon as you stop oxygen delivery to a heart cell, they will start dying within a very short window amount of time. And heart attack, like I said, can happen within minutes depending on the case. And once the thing about heart cells for the human body is that once a heart cell dies, they never come back. This is not a cell where we can just do mitosis and regenerate like our skin or intestinal lining cells. They cannot come back to life once they're dead. And there's nothing we can do to tell our heart to, hey, grow some new cells, because that would be nice. Then no one will die from a heart attack. But whatever you got in your heart cells from the moment you're born, as you grow up, and those are the heart cells you will die with. We don't really regenerate cardiac muscle cells. But yes, so heart cells uses a lot of energy and they increase the fluid, what we call hydrostatic pressure. It's just a fancy term by saying there is this fluid inside this tube, and we're going to use the pump to force this fluid out and going to somewhere else onto other branches of the tube. Okay, so that's just fancy term for that. So if we want to define that, it means that these are the amount of pressure that is exerted by the fluid in an enclosed space. So it's just how much force or how hard is the liquid pushing against the wall of that enclosed space. In this case, within the heart and also within the tubes of blood vessels. And so the more powerful it is, the more hydrostatic pressure it is, and the faster that those fluid will go. So this is what, in a sense, allows fluid flow through all the blood vessels in the body and then goes back to the heart, hopefully, because if it can't go back to the heart, everything stops as well. So it's got to be that one-way circuit when we're talking about circulatory system. So the function of the circulatory system is to transport fluid throughout the body, obviously, and then the circulatory system then connects the environment of body cells to organs that exchange gases, and then they will absorb nutrient and dispose waste. So absorb nutrient meaning for gases case, oxygen, disposed waste, carbon dioxide. Okay, carbon dioxide, it's a waste for our body. Now, even though it's a waste, I'm not going to get into this, but just a quick note about it is even though carbon dioxide is a waste, we have to have homeostasis of carbon dioxide as well. We cannot live without a little bit of carbon dioxide in the body. And again, why that's the case. If you take anatomy and physiology 2 class, we'll talk all about that. All right, so we talked about how previously, and we mentioned this in the previous chapter, that some animals have what's called an open circulatory system, and some animals have what's called a closed circulatory system. So what we mean by when an animal have an open circulatory system is that their circulatory fluid, usually called the hemolymph, is also the same, used interchangeably with the interstitial fluid. What is interstitial fluid? These are fluid that are in direct contact with the cells and tissues and organs of the body. So it is the hemolymph, which is also the interstitial fluid, that will bathe these body cells with whatever nutrients they need and then take away whatever waste they have. So for example, those that have open circulatory systems are some arthropods like grasshoppers and mollusks, such as clams. And so we kind of mentioned those when we talked about those animals back from previous chapter. So what happens in an open circulatory system is you have to have still some sort of a heart. You can't live without a heart for any circulatory system because these are the three basic components of the heart: fluid, vessels, and heart. So you cannot go without a heart. And then they have these interconnected vessels that goes into what's called sinuses. Sinuses are defined as spaces that surrounds the organ. So whenever, because in the body it's supposed to be very packed. Most organisms are that way. We don't just leave a big old hole inside the body out of nowhere, because then organs will travel into that hole. Things will move out of place, etc. So things are just staying in place not only because connective tissues are binding and anchoring them, but it's also everything inside our, let's say our thoracic, which is our chest cavity, and abdominal cavity are very packed. So whenever we have any spaces between those areas or packed space in the body, we call them sinuses. So that's sinuses. And then that's what they use for gas exchange. That's why it's an open system where there's no, vessel that connects those fluid back to the heart. It's just the heart will contract Okay, this thing will contract and then it will pump hemolymph through these circulatory vessels into the some kind of sinus opening of the animal. And then when heart relaxes, so when this relaxes, it will draw those hemolymph fluid back into the heart through pores. Okay, and these pores, they say, have valves in them so that they will close when the heart contracts. So when the heart contracts, these valves are closed off, and then that forces the fluid to move, or hemolymph to move into the vessels, into the sinuses. When the heart relaxes, then these are open, and then all the fluid will then be drawn into the heart, back into the heart. So that's how it circulates. It's kind of like having some sort of fluid that you use a balloon or something, a bulb, to suck it up. Well, first of all, there's some liquid and in the bulb or a balloon, and you squeeze it all out into some sort of an open space area or into a bag, let's say, and then you use that balloon to suck it all back up, suck all that fluid back up. That's really what an open circulatory system means. Now, in addition to just the heart doing its thing, because sometimes remember when we looked at the mollusk or the clams case, that heart was very tiny. So it won't be very efficient in moving a lot of the fluid and getting the fluid moving throughout the whole body of the clam. So some body movements will squeeze those sinuses and help with circulating hemolymph as well, just like the grasshopper's case in this picture here. All right, so there are evolutionary advantage to open circulatory system, because you're like, well, if these are so inefficient, why do we still have it? Because natural selection so always selects for the best, right? So for these creatures, natural selection says this is the best for them, because even though they have very low hydrostatic pressure, because it's just a heart pumping liquid into an open space and sucking that all back up, because of how low hydrostatic pressure this is, very little energy is needed. So the animal doesn't have to spend a humongous amount of calories just on trying to work their circulatory system. They just need very little energy for this type of open circulatory system. Now, additional functions also goes with open circulatory system, because that's something cool about the system, is that they don't just work for distribution of nutrients and disposal of waste. For some animal species, they have other functions. For example, the spiders can use this hydrostatic pressure from the open circulatory system to extend their legs, which is a pretty cool thing. So, because the way they move is very different compared to humans. So they kind of like, if you go back to this sea star where they use hydraulic canals to move, I guess that's how spiders move. They use that hydrostatic pressure to extend legs and get their legs back into the original positions, etc. So that's pretty cool. Something that we, for sure, as mammals, cannot rely on. We need a nervous system for any type of movement. All right. So the other hand, on the opposite side of open circulatory system, is then a closed circulatory system, where the circulatory fluid is now not called hemolymph, but it's called blood. And blood is actually then confined to blood vessels of some sort, and they are distinctly different, okay? Distinct or completely different from the interstitial fluid. Their composition for some animals might be similar, but in most cases, the interstitial fluid, what's in there and what's inside the blood, is very different. That's how it allows for diffusion of stuff between these two bulky fluid. Okay. So an example of who gets closed circulatory systems are annelids, for example, your earthworms, cephalopods, which include your squids and octopuses, and also vertebrates like us humans. So what happens in a closed circulatory system is you have to have one, or in some species, they have more than one heart that will pump blood into large vessels that will branch into smaller ones. And that's a common theme here. What's coming out of the heart are usually large vessels with large diameters, and these large diameter vessels will then become and diverge into smaller, tiny ones, because that's what we need to distribute gases around tissues and organs. We can't have just this big tube splashing at a big organ because that's open circulatory system. We need to have a big tube that then diverge into smaller ones, and it is the smaller ones that can wrap around a particular tissue, wrap around a particular organ, and make sure we are distributing all that nutrient into the same, into every cell of that tissue or organ. So that's why it's a central theme here, where we have large vessel diverging into smaller ones that will infiltrate into the tissues. So that's what you're seeing here. One heart, direction of pumping blood going this way for a large vessel going into smaller vessel that will branch, and then of course those branches of small blood vessels will converge back into one large one and goes back to the heart. So chemical exchange will then occur between the blood and the interstitial fluid because blood is not going anywhere. The blood is not splashing out into the sinuses. That's internal bleeding, okay? So the blood is just circulating around in the circulatory system. That's why they call it the circulatory system. The blood is just going around and around and around, okay? The blood is not seeping out into the space around the or animal's body. So what is around the animal's body is then the interstitial fluid. So there's this. So in this sense, there are two bulk fluid in this case. You have interstitial fluid as a bulk fluid that surrounds all tissues and organs, and then you have blood that's the other bulk fluid that is moving around the circulatory system. So diffusion between these two medium is really what closed circulatory system relies on for exchange of materials. So the fact that we humans still have a closed circulatory system, of course, have its own evolutionary advantage. First of all, the blood pressure has to be very high in order for you to have a closed circulatory system, which is what's contrary to the open circulatory system. And because it's high pressure that's generated by the heart, you can have oxygen and nutrient delivery to larger and more active animals. So you don't see a really large animal having an open circulatory system. This is why octopuses, some large octopuses and large squids actually have closed circulatory system compared with their other cephalopod friends, which are small, a lot smaller. So in order for you to distribute everything throughout the entire large body, you got to have high enough pressure to do that. Second, they can regulate distribution of blood to different organs, and that's because of the fact that there's different small vessels or groups of small vessels. So one group of small vessel can go to the heart, let's say to the lungs, and then one small group vessel can go to the liver, one small little blood vessel can go to the stomach. And not, throughout a 24-hour day, it's not that you need blood in every single one of these areas. We have a way to distribute blood so that it only goes to areas where it's most necessary. And it will be a more extreme case when we're talking about in a desperate environment, like if you're starving and under a drought, under malnutrition, we talked about in the previous chapter, then your body will shunt blood away from other places that is not necessary at the moment to keep you alive longer. So that is something that is special to closed circulatory system animals. They can regulate the distribution of blood to different areas of the body. All right, so let's get talking about some of the closed circulatory systems we have in different animals. So for vertebrates, even within vertebrates itself, there are different types of closed circulatory system. So for sharks, rays, and bony fishes, which are usually your aquatic animals, blood actually travels through the body and returns to a starting point in a single circulation. Only one loop of blood vessels is what we're talking about when we're talking about single circulation. Just one loop around the entire car circulatory system. So the heart for these guys have two chambers. One is called the atrium, which is where blood will enter the heart, or atrium collects the blood from the body. And then you have the ventricle, which is where blood leaves the heart. So that's why you see a heart right here, one chamber up here, one chamber down there. The upper chamber there is the atrium. Atrium tends to be, the smaller one across all vertebrate animals. And then the ventricle is the lower one, which is usually larger because it's got a pump to the rest of the body. So ventricle will contract to pump blood from the artery. So this is actually the artery right there that going up. So blood will leave from the ventricle into the artery when the ventricle muscle pumps. When this pumps, blood goes into this artery, which then will go into the capillary bed that surrounds or infiltrate into the gills of the fish. Because remember, fish have gills, not lungs. So once the blood reaches the capillary of the gills, it will pick up oxygen because that's the whole point of gills is to take in oxygen from the water and then remove carbon dioxide from the blood back into the water. And then what's coming out of the gill should be oxygenated blood that's just replenished oxygen from the environment, in this case the water, and they have already dropped off carbon dioxide to the water in the gills. And so from the gills, the blood goes directly into another capillary beds or multiple capillary beds, depending on the size of the fish, where they will deliver oxygen and also pick up carbon dioxide. So all this high, so usually in these circulatory system, blue means that and they like to call it deoxygenated versus oxygenated, but that also doesn't mean that it's completely deplete of oxygen. It's just what we call oxygen poor blood versus oxygen rich blood. So that just means there's still some oxygen here, but it's just not enough to keep the animal alive. So it's got to go to the gills, pick up oxygen. Now you have oxygen rich blood, and also carbon dioxide has been depleted into the water, and you can then deliver it straight to capillary beds in your tissues. Now notice that what happens when fluid goes from larger diameter vessels to smaller diameter vessels is that the pressure goes down tremendously. I'm not going to get into this because I thought it was too much, but just quick note about, surface area is that when we have one big large tube versus gazillion of tiny little tubes, the surface area is a lot larger for the tiny gazillion tiny little tubes compared to the one large tube. So when you're talking about blood coming out of one large tube into gazillion of tiny little tubes, it's a huge surface area change. And hence, because of all that surface area, everything slows down. Okay, so the blood slows down once it hits the capillary beds, and then the pressure then also goes down. Um, Velocity, pressure, blood volume, all is related to each other, but I'm not going to go into that here. But just know that when you're talking about blood moving from one large tube into a gazillion smaller tiny tubes, it will really decrease the pressure a lot because of the great surface area those gazillion tiny tubes have. So by the time you're coming out of here from the gills, the blood's pressure has already greatly been dissipated by the capillaries within the gills. So things are usually moving in quite slow pressure or low pressure, and blood will move slowly to the other capillary bed. So this is why for these sharks, rays, and bony fishes, it is low pressure coming out of the gills to distribute the blood towards the rest of the body. And then from there, once we have distributed to all the capillary beds in the body, it will then converge back into one single tube. And this is when the pressure or speed of the blood will, the speed of the blood, not pressure, speed of the blood might build up back a little bit again, just to get back into the vein that will go back into the atrium of the heart. Why the speed will pick back up? Because you're going from a gazillion tiny tubes back into one large tube with a lot less surface area. But pressure is not going to go back up too much because of the fact that it's already very low pressure by the time you're done going through all the capillary beds in the body. Okay, so from from atria, okay, one more time, from atria into artery, into the gills of capillary beds, goes straight into another capillary bed of the body, and then goes back by veins towards the atrium of the heart. Okay, so that's a single circulation of sharks, rays, and bony fishes. And this is also something very different compared to mammals and humans, is that you have capillary bed going towards another capillary bed. That never happens for the human body. After one capillary bed, you always goes back to vein right away for human body. And we'll get to that when we get to double circulation. So for vertebrates such as amphibians, reptiles, and mammals, their blood flows through two circuits or two loops called double circulation. So this is where both circuits are pumped by a single heart. So even though you have two loops going on in the circulatory system, the heart probably usually have more than two chambers, more than two chambers that will pump to both loops. Okay, pump to both loops in that sense. So one circuit, right side of the heart pumps oxygen poor blood two capillary beds of gas exchange tissue, such as lungs, okay, in this case, where oxygen will then go into the blood, carbon dioxide will come out of the blood into the lungs. So don't worry, let me explain this. So here's the heart, okay? Blood will come out of the heart, usually the right side. Remember, this is where anatomy students always confuse themselves as well. Your right is not that heart's right that you're looking at. Okay, so you're looking at a heart. So it is like this is where if this is your right, then what I call the patient's right, then is the other side because you're looking at them straight on the opposite side. Okay, so make sure you remember your right is not the patient's right. And it will be the other side, that is the person you're looking at on the other side. That's the right side. So this right side is blue because it has oxygen poor blood. And so from the heart's ventricle, it will be pumped into the capillary bed of the lungs in this case. Or for some animals, they have other organs for gas exchange, like the skin. So whichever it is, just some sort of gas exchange tissue, which is lungs. I'll just say lungs. And then they will pick up oxygen from the lungs, drop off carbon dioxide to the lungs. And now what's coming out of the lungs are blood that are full of oxygen and now low in carbon dioxide, ready to go back into the heart. The heart then pump again, which then allows that oxygenated blood or oxygen-rich blood to go out into the body's tissue, which is the other circuit, and deliver all the oxygen that has just picked up from the lungs to all the parts of the body, whether it be your just connective tissue, your liver, stomach, etc. And then as the blood passes through this capillary bed, it will drop off oxygen and when it will collect carbon dioxide from the cells, which is a waste product from cellular respiration. And then it will come back into the heart on the other side, ready to do the whole circuit all over again. Okay, so you see how there's one loop here for picking up oxygen and dropping off carbon dioxide. And there's another loop here for delivery of oxygen and picking up carbon dioxide. Okay, so the one that is for picking up oxygen and dropping off the carbon dioxide is what we call the pulmonary circuit because it's a double circuit, two loop type of deal. So pulmonary circuit, we call it that because gas exchange takes place in the lungs. Now, that's for reptiles and mammals. For amphibians, they have a special feature where they can actually breathe through their skin. Now, this is something cool because gas exchange has to go through areas that are moist. So this is why if you think about, oh, why is amphibian so slimy when we pick up a frog? Well, that's because there's mucus on top of their skin, and we talked about how there's glands that secrete that mucus on their skin. And it is that mucus that allow for gas exchange between the skin and the environment. So this is something only unique to amphibians that they can do. So that's why for them is not just called the pulmonary circuits. For them, it is called pulmocutaneous circuits. So just because they can do it through skin doesn't mean they can't do it through lungs. So they have a double thing. Okay, but they do say that the bulk of the gas exchange happens across their skin versus the lungs, but it doesn't mean they don't use their lungs. They still use their lungs a little bit. So that's why it's called pulmo. For pulmo, anything starts with pulmonary, that is lungs. Cutaneous is then the other root word or important word, clinical terms for skin, some sort of skin surface. Okay, so that's why it's for pulmocutaneous circuits for the amphibians. What about the other circuit? Well, in all vertebrates' case, they have the other one is just called systemic circuits, where I already talked about the left side of the heart right here pumps oxygen-rich blood to capillary beds of organs and tissues throughout the body, allow oxygen to come out of the blood and CO2 to go into the blood, and it goes right back to the heart, ready to go again, another round in the pulmonary circuit. All right, so just remember pulmonary circuit goes towards the lungs. Systemic circuit sounds like a system of some sort. It goes towards your body system. So you can never get it wrong if you think about the name of the circuit, okay? Pulmonary circuit only goes towards the lungs. Systemic circuit goes towards your body systems. So this double circulation then provides blood flow to the vertebrate's brain, muscles, and other organs. And because heart repressurizes, in a sense, because before with the fish, it weren't able to do that. After it picked up oxygen from the gills, there's no going back to the other side of the heart and get pumping again. Okay, so in a sense, the heart pumping action powers the pulmonary circuits and at the same time powers the systemic circuit. That's the beauty of double circulation. So it allows that blood to repressurize after losing all that pressure going through the lungs capillary beds. It gets pumped once again out of the heart with a high pressure to reach the other capillary beds, which again will slow it down and then go back right to the heart. So that is something that double circulation is able to do. There's higher blood pressure in the systemic circuit, if anything, even more so than the pulmonary circuit, because if you think about how far your heart is from your lungs, it's not that far. There's not a lot of gravity and distance to fight with, so the overall pressure in the pulmonary circuit is lower. Whereas if we're talking about your entire body, um, you gotta fight gravity to pump blood all the way up to your head, within your brain, within your skull, and then you gotta, once it's back into the toes, goes all the way down to your toes, it's always also gotta climb back all the way back up to the heart. So there's specific features that allows for veins to bring things against gravity back to the heart, and we'll talk about that when we get to the blood vessels. All right, so birds and mammals have one further difference between amphibians and your reptiles and other mammals. So birds and mammals are special ones where they differ a little bit. Their hearts have a complete division between the right and the left side. Because when you look at the frog's heart right here, is actually two atria and one ventricle. Okay, there's no solid division between the two halves of the ventricle. So that's why you see this purple color going on here, which means that there's some mixing of oxygenated blood with, oxygen rich blood with some oxygen poor blood in that sense. Whereas for birds and mammals, it's a solid division. There's a whole piece of tissue that divides the two atria and the two ventricles. To ensure this is for real, two solid, separated individual pumps that will pump oxygen, poor blood to pick up oxygen, and also there's no mixing of oxygen poor blood with oxygen rich blood because of that solid division between the two pumps, and you have very, very efficient gas exchange. Now, but that there, because of that, there is something that we can't do is being able to dive underwater for a long time. Why these amphibians and some reptiles have this type of closed double circulatory system is the fact that they can easily shunt blood away from the lungs and rely on other things for getting oxygen temporarily. Okay, so this is why they can usually live, dive or swim for a long time underwater, and they can go on land as well. But they can't live in water forever. They can't be submerged in water forever. They still got to come back up for oxygen because of the fact that they just shunting blood away from the lungs temporarily. But when air is available again, they will breathe with their lungs. All right, so some invertebrates with double circulation are intermittent breathers, which is what I was talking about earlier. So they only fill lungs periodically and on land by air. So they are able Thus, they are able to pass long periods without gas exchange, or can rely on other tissues for gas exchange. Now, that's two different things depending on what kind of animal it is. Some of them they can just not breathe for a long time because other places they will store a lot of oxygen, or they can use other tissues for doing the gas exchange part of it. So I already talked about frogs. Frogs and other amphibians have a three-chambered heart, which is the two atria and the one ventricle. The ventricle has some sort of little ridge at the bottom that makes sure somehow that the oxygen-rich blood doesn't get mixed too much with the oxygen-poor blood. There's a little bit of mixing, but not entirely. So there's a ridge within the ventricle that diverts most of the oxygen-rich blood towards the from the left atrium into the systemic circuit to the rest of the body, and most of the oxygen poor blood from the right atrium into the pulmocutaneous circuit that goes towards the lungs or the skin to pick up oxygen. So once the frog is underwater, however, it actually takes advantage of this incomplete division of the ventricle, where the ventricle is just one big giant hole or cavity, and then so it will shut off the circuit towards the lungs and allow blood to flow mostly in the skin when underwater. So when the frog is submerged, the only site of gas exchange is the skin, where the skin is able to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide within water medium itself because of the fact that it has this incomplete division of the ventricle. It only has one ventricle. Similar case with turtles, snakes, and lizards. They also have only a three-chambered heart with an incomplete septum in the ventricle. So what is a septum? Septum means there's some sort of tissue that divides two hollow areas within an organ. Okay, so this is what we call the interventricular septum in human anatomy, is because this is lying between the ventricle and is a tissue that divides the two. So that's why it's called interventricular septum. But for turtles, snakes, and lizards, they have an incomplete one where the septum doesn't go all the way up to close off the ventricles. There's still some mixing of the blood between oxygen poor and oxygen rich. But then again, it is this incomplete interventricular septum that divide the right and left into two chambers somewhat, and it allows for the animal to be able to control the amount of blood flowing to the lungs, or when the animal is submerged underwater, they can use other organs for gas exchange. So there's two major arteries that's called the aortas that lead to systemic circulation, such that, okay, when the animal is underwater, it blocks off the flow to lungs so that it just circulates over the systemic circuit in that sense. So the pulmonary artery, or the PA here, is not functional when these animals are submerged because the lungs is not used. So deoxygenated blood gets shunted elsewhere for oxygen. Now, with alligators and caimans or other crocodilians of some sort, they have a fully formed four-chamber heart, two atria and two ventricles, just like humans do. And they have extensive network of oxygen storing blood vessels in their muscles and tissues, and they are able to slow down their metabolism. So this is why alligators or crocodilians can also be submerged underwater for long periods of time. They do have this complete interventricular septum in the middle that divides the two ventricles into two chambers, two separate chambers, one for pulmonary circuit and one for systemic circuits. But there is an area where it connects. There's a little opening that connects the two somewhere in the larger vessels up here. Okay, so both pulmonary and systemic circuit connect where the arteries exit the heart. And then there's something called an arterial valve that goes between these two, such that when the animal is submerged underwater, that little valve opens and allows for connection to allow that temporary shunting of blood away from the lungs. Okay, so it's because I mean, it's not like they're allowing blood to travel between the two ventricles for these animals, but there is a small opening up here where the tubes itself, the large vessels itself, have a little connection for blood to shunt between the two circuits. Now, this sounds like it's an awesome thing for these animals, but note that humans can't afford to have this mixing of oxygen rich versus oxygen poor blood because we primarily live on land. That's why I guess through natural selection, by the time we get to humans, we don't need all this stuff because it completely closes off. As you can see, from very small organism, things are getting larger and larger, and the heart is also getting from 3 chambers all the way down to fully 4 chambers. And then for humans, completely closing off that little connection between the arteries or the big blood vessels at the top of the heart where blood exits, because we need a complete separate pulmonary circuit and systemic circuit to make sure there's very efficient oxygen pickup and carbon dioxide drop off in that sense. So that's why we can't afford for blood to mix. If anything, there are actually um, baby where they can have congenital heart diseases, and that is where, for example, the interventricular septum didn't form properly, and it just kind of grows and then stops. So there are humans that are born with an incomplete interventricular septum. That's called a ventricular septal defect, and that baby will have a lot of problems breathing, and they will have to go undergo surgeries to fix that, things like that. So if anything, for a human, we cannot afford to have such a heart. But for these other mammals and animals, they can afford that because that's the way they best fit their particular living environment. That's why the natural selection has given them these particular hearts that allow them to remain submerged in water. So all right. Hence, just one more time again. Now we are at mammalian circulation, which is very similar to the other circulations we've been talking about, but just as third times in a sense, reviewing the whole pulmonary circuit and systemic circuits. Now we're going to go through the mammalian or human circulation. So let's go through the pulmonary circuit again, just one more time, because I know it can be confusing at first. All right, so follow along. You start at right side of the heart. Okay, so you start at the right ventricle of the heart. So remember, this side is the right side, this side is the left side. Okay, so this round here is the right ventricle, and I tell my students that you can tell it's a ventricle because of the V shape that it has, whereas atria is not really a V shape. And blood always goes from atria into ventricle, so it goes in alphabetical order. Okay, blood never goes from atria back. Obviously, it'll go from the ventricle back to the atria. That never happens. If that happens, a disease happens, okay, or condition happens. So blood starts at the right ventricle, okay, gets pumped. Okay, when that ventricle squeezes, pumps blood into the pulmonary arteries. These are the pulmonary arteries right here. They kind of skipped over labeling this, okay, and I want to label this because they say the valve are in pulmonary arteries, which is incorrect, okay. There's this particular area before the split of the pulmonary artery. This area is called the pulmonary trunk, okay. Pulmonary trunk divides into your 2 pulmonary arteries. Why 2 is because you have a right lung and a left lung. So that's why the pulmonary arteries got to split into one that goes towards the right lung, while one goes toward the left lungs. Okay. In the lungs, they will pick up oxygen, okay, and drop off carbon dioxide. So that's why the blood will flow through all the capillary beds within the right lung and the left lung and loads on their oxygen and unloads carbon dioxide. Now, what's coming out of the lungs, these are called pulmonary veins, either side. Then our oxygen-rich blood, now full of oxygen, now and also low in carbon dioxide, will go back into the left atrium of the heart. Okay, so that's why this left atrium of the heart is red. Okay, so that completes the pulmonary circuit from the right ventricle all the way to left atrium. All right. All right, then you're ready for the systemic circuits now, because now you got that oxygenated blood or oxygen-rich blood in the heart. So now oxygen-rich blood flows from the left atrium into the left ventricle. Some of it is passive filling, that such that the blood just drains into the ventricle, but the atria will still at the end have to squeeze a little bit to contract and get all the blood into the ventricle. Once the left ventricle gets all the blood they have, they will pump blood into what's called the aorta. Okay. The aorta then will split into arteries that can supply the body from organs in the head or organs in the feet. Okay, either way. So there's many arteries that will go through capillary beds throughout the body's tissues, whether in your head or your limbs, and they will unload their oxygen to your tissues and organs and cells, and reload all those CO2, carbon dioxide you have that is a waste product from your cells, from cellular respiration. And then that blood coming out of the capillary bed is now oxygen poor blood because you just dropped off oxygen and just picked up carbon dioxide. Then all that oxygen poor blood goes back to the heart via veins, and the veins will then converge into one big giant blood vessel vein called either the superior vena cava or the inferior vena cava. Okay, superior vena cava will collect blood from the upper part of your body, and then the inferior vena cava will collect blood from the lower parts of the body. Both of them will drain blood into the right atrium. And then from there, oxygen poor blood will flow into the right ventricle, and we're back at step one of pulmonary circuits all over again. So for systemic circuit, you begin with the left ventricle and you end with the right atrium. Okay? So if you need that to go, need for me to go over that one more time, feel free to rewind and rewatch it one more time. Okay? All right, so here's the video that kind of shows you quickly what is pulmonary circuit versus systemic circuit. Pulmonary circuits, they have depicted as blue. Systemic circuit, they have depicted as red.
The right side of the heart produces pulmonary circulation. This is the movement of deoxygenated blood from the body through the right atrium and ventricle, out through the pulmonary artery, and to the lungs.
So all that blue area.
Oxygenated in the lungs alveoli returns to the heart
And now it's
through
red.
the pulmonary veins. The left side of the heart produces systemic
there.
circulation.
Through the aorta,
This is the
through the
movement
systemic.
of oxygenated blood returning from the lungs to the left atrium and ventricle and out through the aorta to be distributed to the rest of the body.
Okay. There's actually a descending aorta as well that goes towards the lower part of your body, but you don't need to know that. All right. Okay, then we are ready to talk about the other intricate parts of the heart, because we were just talking about them having these chambers. So what are those chambers? And then there's actually a lot of valves in there to make sure, like I said, blood doesn't flow back into an area that they're not supposed to. The one key thing about closed circulatory system, or open for that matter, blood always flow in one direction. It's a unidirectional movement because blood cannot backflow to another area. It has this perfect, circulation such that it drops off oxygen, pick up carbon dioxide, and then goes to another area to pick up oxygen and drop off the carbon dioxide. So it's just that unidirection thing. Okay, so that's why blood cannot backtrack, or else that you end up mixing oxygen rich with oxygen poor blood, and it's going to be a bad story. So the heart itself is a fist-sized organ. They always call it fist size, depending how big your fist is, or it also depends on the size of your body. People with a really large size body also tends to have a larger heart because their heart have to work a lot harder to pump the blood everywhere in their body. So, depending on your health conditions, the size of your heart can differ too. I've seen hearts that are the size of my face at a pathology lab where it was I think a 300-pound person that has passed away from a cardiac arrest and heart attack. And they show me their hearts that has been preserved to show others and students, teachers, professors, how the heart looks like. And that heart was literally the size of my face. Okay, just imagine the size of your face compared to your fist. That's how big your heart can get. We call that hypertrophy of the cardiac muscles called the myometrium, and it enlarges the muscles quite a bit when we're talking about pumping heart to such a huge body. So, and then again, we'll get to cardiovascular system towards the end of the heart portion of the chapter. So the location of the heart is behind the sternum. Sternum is, I call it the little necktie on your chest. So if you wear ties on the collar shirt, where your necktie is, that's approximately where your sternum is. And then behind that is then your heart and is mostly made up of cardiac muscles. And cardiac muscles is something that you don't have the voluntary control. They will do their own thing. Okay. And I'll talk about how that's the case in a bit. All right, so the heart has four chambers for humans, and there two of them are the smaller ones up here called the atrium. So atrium singular, atria for plural. So these are usually thinner walled compared to the ventricles, and they are also smaller in size, like I've said, and they collect blood returning back to the heart or from the lungs. Okay, so in this area is returned back to the heart from the systemic circuit, and this left atrium right here is for collecting blood back from the lungs in the pulmonary circuit. And then they will contract to push blood into their respective ventricles. So right atrium will go down to right ventricle. It can't cross over to left ventricle. That's a big problem if that's the case. So it goes right atrium, goes straight into right ventricle. Left atrium goes straight into your left ventricle. Then from the ventricle, these are your thicker wall, a lot thicker. You see how thin that little pink line is that surrounds the atria compared to the thick pink line that surrounds the ventricle. So these are because of the powerful muscles that is needed to pump blood towards the entire system, which is the systemic circuit, and also the enough pressure to pump through all those little tiny capillaries inside the lungs that surround your tiny alveoli. That's why then you have this thick muscle in the right ventricle as well. But know that left ventricle is usually thicker than your right ventricle because we need more pressure to get blood towards the rest of your body. So ventricles will contract more forcefully than atria because of the fact that you're going to a lot more tinier blood vessels at the end of the day for pulmonary circuits that goes towards the lungs for right ventricle and then systemic circuit for the left ventricle. Systemic circuit meaning your body tissues. Okay. So I already said the left ventricle wall is usually thicker than the right one due to the force needed to push blood towards every single part of your body, whether all the way up at your head or all the way down to your toes. And then between your atria and the ventricles, you have a set of valves. These are called the atrioventricular valves. There's actually a specific name for these two valves. You don't have to worry about that for now, for our class. Okay, just know it as atrioventricular valves or AV valves as an abbreviation. Um, Now, if this was ever on the exam as a short answer, you can put AV valves. You don't have to spell out atrioventricular, but my rule for abbreviation is that you cannot misspell it. If you put AP valve, that's completely wrong. No partial credit. But if you put atrioventricular valve, then I will still give you full credit for a slight misspelling. So if you put the whole word, you can have partial credit if you misspell it, but it still sounds pretty similar. But my rule for abbreviation is that you cannot misspell it. So no partial credit for a misspelled abbreviation. All right, so these two valves here is then what allows for blood to be flowing or pumping from the atria into the ventricle, hence its name, atrioventricular valve. And then when atria is pumping or flowing blood into the ventricle, these valves are open. And then when All the blood has drained from or pumped in from the atria into the ventricle, and now it's the ventricle's turn to pump and squeeze. These valves will shut. Okay, so it should be closed when the ventricles are squeezing because that blood has got to go to the pulmonary circuit or that blood has got to go to the systemic circuit. It cannot black flow into the atria here or there. Okay, because if blood from here back flows into the atria, then it's not going to go to the lungs to pick up oxygen. Then it's just going to go back to your vena cavas and go on back to the body and keep mixing deoxygenated blood over and over in circles, okay, without ever picking up oxygen. So that's why these valves got to close when ventricles, right ventricle, squeeze and contract so that blood goes straight into the pulmonary trunk into the pulmonary arteries to get to your pulmonary circuits of lungs to pick up oxygen. Now, for left ventricle, same thing. Once that oxygenated comes back from the left atrium, all this oxygenated blood then gotta go out the aorta. Aorta. You can't have it go back into the left atrium because then it will just go back to the lungs, which is making all that good oxygen for nothing because we gotta deliver that oxygen to the rest of the body. So that's why this AV valve's gotta shut when ventricles pump so that the blood can then go on to your systemic circuit. So because of how powerful these ventricle muscles are compared to the atria, when it squeezes, sometimes when it contracts, if let's say it doesn't have any anchoring whatsoever, I'm going to redraw it up here because then, so this is the half of the heart, this is the atria, okay? And there's that valve between the atria and the ventricle. So when, ventricles are squeezing, blood can push against this valve, okay, to close it. But because the ventricle squeeze and contract with such a huge force, that valve can actually revert into the atria and then we're in trouble. Because what happens is that between the atria and the ventricles, the valve is supposed to be shut like this. Okay, so there are two little curvature like that as valves that prevent the blood from going in to the atria and then they'll move on to wherever they're going to for the circuits. So sometimes it can be so hard if there's nothing to anchor these valves that the valves can end up reversing back into the atria like that. And now blood can freely flow through the atria. So this is why AV valves are anchored by very strong fibers. These are really strong fibers. It's unfortunate that we don't get to dissect as an online class, but this is where I show students feel how strong those strong fibers are. When we look at pig heart, I tell my students, go and try to rip that fiber. They literally look like little threads connecting the valves to the heart muscle. But if you try to tear it, pull as strong as you might, those threads are not going to break. Okay, so that's how strong those fibers are now, unless you are a really, 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 really strong person, like a bodybuilder and something, then that's a different story. But I'm talking about, a regular average person. So those fibers are very strong to make sure that AV valve never reverts back into the atria. Again, because of the importance or high critical importance of unidirection blood flow. When you have a valve that reverses into the atria, the AV valves doing that, then you lose the unidirectional flow. So this is why you have those strong anchoring of the AV valves to make sure it stays curved like this into the ventricle and never goes out reverse back into the atria like that. So there's these little fibers like that pulls on it such that it will remain shut, okay, and can't go the other way around. All right, and then the other two set of valves are up here within the pulmonary trunk and the other one within the aorta. These are called semilunar valves, and they are those that, the valves that cut off or prevent blood from back flowing into the ventricle after the ventricle has pushed blood into the pulmonary circuit or into the systemic circuit. You don't want that blood to fall back down by gravity into the ventricle. Then the ventricle is, doing very inefficient work, and you have to work harder. So when blood is pushed from the left ventricle into the aorta for the systemic circuits, That blood can try to fall back down by gravity, but it won't go back into the ventricles because of the fact that you have that semilunar valve to stop that blood from flowing backwards, and then it will be continue on with the elasticity of the aorta. Same thing with the pulmonary circuits. Right ventricle push blood into the pulmonary trunk for the pulmonary circuits. Gravity may try to pull that blood back, but as soon as that blood come back, it closes up the semilunar valve, and now the blood can be sure to go in unidirection towards the lungs. So for these semilunar valves, they should open when the ventricles contract and they should close when the ventricles relax. So again, I'm circling those things because students always get confused about which is open, which is closed, during what is contracting or relaxing. So make sure you're clear about that for the exam purposes. And so when we're hearing someone's heartbeat, let's say with a stethoscope or you're putting your ears on their chest, you usually hear their heartbeat as lub dub, lub dub, lub dub. Okay, so that lub dub sound comes from closing of these valves. It's like these valves doing really strong closing when the ventricles contract. So when the ventricles contract, lub, okay, that AV valve right here would close really quickly, lub, okay. And then when ventricles contract to push blood that way, blood flowing that way, and then those blood try to come back down, then those semilunar valves will then close really quickly. Dub. Okay, so lub is the closing of the AV valves, dub is the closing of the semilunar valves. Remember, it is when the valves are closing. More than once, I've seen students tell me, oh, the sounds are from opening the valves. Just imagine a door. Okay, valves are like doors. When you open the door, are there any sounds? There might be creaking sounds if your door is, badly oiled, but there's no sound when you open the door. But imagine if you slam that door shut really quickly. Bam, right? So it is always closing the valves that gives you the hard sound, not opening. Just remember my door analogy. Open door, no sound. Slam that door closed, you have a bam sound, just like valves. Open valve, you might hear sound where the blood is flowing through. Okay, but you can't pick that up unless you're very, trained on hearing heart sounds. And then you hear lub dub, lub dub, lub dub like that. Okay, and that is the valves closing on you. All right, it is 1 hour 15 minutes, so we will stop part one right here.